Is drinking raw milk safe like RFK Jr. suggests? Can you reduce a glucose spike if you eat your food in, quote unquote, the right order? I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp. I host a nutrition myth-busting podcast called Bite Back with Abby Sharp. And those are just some of the questions I tackle with qualified experts on my show. There is so much food misinformation and disinformation out there, and it can feel impossible to know what's real and what's BS. On Bite Back, my goal is to help listeners create a pleasurable relationship with food, their body, and themselves, which in my opinion is the fundamental secret to good health. Listen to Bite Back wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Does the order in which you're born into your family really make a difference in how your life unfolds? We've known for ages that we're molded in how we're raised by our parents or guardians, but what about the impact our siblings have on who we become and our future success, or lack thereof? I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Susan Dominus, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the New York Times and author of a new book called The Family Dynamic: A Journey into the Mystery of Sibling Success. Susan, thanks so much for being here. Let's dive right in. So what got you interested in studying siblings?
I was just one of these kids who was always fascinated by other people's families. And I was always interested a little bit in success, as many of us are. And so I just always been preoccupied with families in which so many, in which an unexpected number of siblings are very high achieving, and curious to know what it was in their upbringing that made them that way.
Okay, so let's talk about high achievers then. You mentioned there, sometimes you come across, those rare families where all the kids are successful, those families we kind of don't like, perhaps even successful in different fields. What does your research tell us about these high achieving families across the board?
Well, they're outliers. And to some degree, the book is all about the idiosyncratic nature of these really unusual families. And each of there's 6 families I focus on, and each of them tells their own complicated, nuanced story that I should say is as much about the costs of ambition as it is about the rewards. But I think that I did see a common theme among the families, which is that they often had parents who themselves had overcome something extraordinary. Even if they didn't get famous doing it, they were very, very energetic and tough people who both modeled that and I think implicitly encouraged it in their own kids. And also, there was a spirit of optimism. There was the sense of like the family mottos were things like, all things possible, or with God's help, all things possible. So I was very struck by how much the family culture encouraged a sense of optimism.
Okay, and then let's talk about birth order, because I'm sure people listening right here are listening to this and sitting back and thinking about where they fall in the pecking order in their family and how they relate to their siblings and what impact that might have played. So how much does birth order really matter, and how do we differ from our siblings based on where we fall in that pecking order?
I think a lot of people explain themselves and their entire family dynamic on the basis of birth order. It's a very natural place to go, and there have been really big books about it. But in more recent years, the really good research that's been done finds that there is no real correlation between birth order and personality. I know that's incredibly surprising, but what they explain is that if the oldest sibling who's maybe 18 in a family seems like the most conscientious, but the younger sibling who's maybe 14, by the time that person gets to be 18, might be just as conscientious or even more so. It's like we basically underestimate the effect of just maturity differences in kids and explaining why they act the way that they do. But we do know this other thing, which is that the oldest child does tend to have, on average, a cognitive edge over the other siblings. And we think that's because the oldest child is the only one who was ever an only child. And so they have a couple of years, let's say, before their second child comes along. The parents have time to focus all of their energy and all of their resources into this one child. By the time there's a second child, the parents have to divide their time. So there's a thinking that this enrichment is really important. And also when kids get older, they tend to teach their younger siblings whatever it might be, from tying shoelaces to learning to read. And that solidifies their own knowledge and maybe even gives them some confidence.
So essentially, the firstborn kind of gets to hog the parents to themselves for a few years or however long it takes for the other sibling or siblings to come along, and then it's sort of split attention. So you break down the effect that siblings can have on one another into sort of two main categories: differentiation and spillover effect. Can you elaborate on these and sort of tell us what they are?
Yeah. So siblings, there's this natural inclination, we think, among siblings to differentiate. And one of the reasons we know that is because we know that the oldest child tends to be the most academically strong. And then you see that younger children tend to be overrepresented in things like elite sports, or even
Mm.
somebody did a massive study examining just general varsity sport participation. And they found that it was more common in younger siblings than older siblings. So there's this idea that the oldest child, maybe we know that they have this academic advantage. The younger children maybe try to find something else where they can excel. And actually, in my book, Lauren Groff's, there's a family I write about the Groffs, and Adam Groff is the oldest brother, very academic, younger sister Lauren, who went on to become this renowned novelist. And their younger sister, Sarah True, became an Olympic triathlete and world-class Ironman champion. And she remembers making a concerted, like an actual decision when she was about 14 years old, that she was going to own sports, that she was going to be a great swimmer. Because although her sister was really great at swimming, she didn't care as much about it as she did other things. And Sarah just decided that was going to be her strong suit.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So they chose very different fields, the Groff family, but all excelled to really the highest degree in whatever they chose. So that's an example of differentiation where the siblings sort of, I guess, motivated each other by carving out a lane, and the subsequent siblings wanted, in effect, their own lane, their own path.
Yeah, it definitely seems like that. And you actually have differentiation happening more in families with resources. The Groffs were the children of a doctor and a teacher. And, I don't think they spoiled their children by a long stretch. But in families with resources, the kids, the parents tend to value differentiation a little bit more. And also, they can encourage it more. They have the time, the space, the money.
Okay, so that's differentiation. That makes sense in my mind. What about the spillover effect? What is that? And can you sort of give us of an example of the spillover effect in practice?
Yeah, sibling spillover effects are just this idea that when one kid tends to do pretty well in school, you tend to see that having a beneficial effect on the grades of another kid in the school. Of another sibling in the school. And for a long time, we haven't known whether that was because just some kind of genetic overlap, or whether it's because parents parented them the same way and kind of set down certain expectations, or whether there was actually effect of one sibling on the other. Someone did a really interesting study, and she conducted the study by looking at school start dates, because we know that when kids are old for their grade, they tend to do better than kids who are young for their grade. And it's not necessarily because they're smarter. It's just they have this little academic boost that, makes it possible for them to be developmentally farther along. Teachers like you better because you can sit still in your chair. There's this whole kind of a feedback loop. So kids who are old for their grade, just by virtue of when their birthday falls, do better in school. And what this researcher found was that the younger siblings of those kids who were old for their grade also did better in school than might be expected, because regardless of when their birthday was. So they weren't old for their grade or anything like that. They had no natural advantage. It was definitely the sibling having the advantage that trickled down to the other sibling.
Fascinating. So if there's a child who's born early in the year, let's say January or February, and they have a younger sibling who's not necessarily born early in the year, the younger sibling could still benefit from some of those spillover effects by that first sibling setting a high academic bar.
That's exactly right. Perfectly put. Thank you. Yes.
I read about the advantage of having a child born early in the year in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. He talked a little bit about that in there as well from an academic and an athletic perspective. I mean, after learning now what we've learned here, do you think there's just going to be, hordes of families trying to conceive in March and April so they can try and time out a January or February baby? Or is that am I misreading this?
It's complicated because we know that these kids do better in school. There are also advantages to being a little bit young for your grade, and that you're challenged academically. And the more school that you get, the better, basically. So it's for your IQ. So it's possible that like kids do better in school, but does it like actually enhance their IQ down the road? It's a mixed bag. Because also if you miss a year of if you start school a little bit late, then you're also like late to earnings. And some people think that so many boys are being held back, and so that they're kind of old for their grade. That it's one of the reasons why there's this big problem with boys not finishing high school, which is they sort of feel over it and too old for it, and they want to get into the workforce. There's been some research on that too. So these things probably play out differently based on, economics, family circumstances, those kinds of things.
And in terms of, you sort of painted a nice example with the Groff family in terms of differentiation. In your research, was there a family you focus on or a family you can use to sort of illuminate the spillover effect?
Well, I can't prove that it was a spillover effect at work, but the Chen family immigrated to America from China. And the oldest sibling in that family, her English was not great when she came to the country naturally. And so they held her back not just 1 year, but 2 years, right? So now she's, the oldest child by 2 years in her grade. And that really makes a difference in how teachers respond to you because, she was very mature and very responsible and very together. And she did extremely well in school. And she also really took it upon herself because her parents were running a Chinese restaurant. This is in Bristol, Virginia, which is essentially Appalachia. Um, she really took it upon herself to bring her siblings along and coach them and make sure that they lived up to her standards. So, you see the sibling spillover effects actually being stronger in financially disadvantaged families like the Chens, in part because the siblings do spend more time to each other for reasons that were true of the Chens as well. Their parents are working long hours. They don't have tons of money for extracurriculars. So they spend a lot of time together.
That's really interesting. And the spillover effect, can it also work the other way, negatively, if you will, negative spillover?
Yes, it absolutely can. And it's in some ways it can explain why things can be so tough for kids in disadvantaged families because if you have an older sibling, let's say, who experiences some disruptive event, an adverse childhood event that affects the family, that sister's grades maybe are going to really suffer. Now, that event, whatever it is, this disruption is going to affect the younger sibling as well, just because they're both being exposed to it. But once the older sibling's grades go down, there's that knockoff effect that so the younger siblings whose grades have already been lowered by this disruption now also suffers from having the older sibling have an impact that trickles down. So it's like a 1-2 punch, if that makes sense. A lot of the difference is sort of because grades translate into income down the road, they correlate very closely. The researcher who did this study on school start dates and sibling spillover effects believes that sibling effects account for a large part of the economic differences between families.
I'm wondering if, the self-fulfilling prophecy sort of plays into sibling outcomes at all. For example, if, the parents sort of rightly or wrongly peg one of their children as the quote unquote smarter one, maybe they start putting them in more intellectually based extracurriculars, and maybe they see another kid as the sportier one and choose their extracurriculars as such. Does that play a factor, sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect determined by parents?
Yeah, there is definitely some research that suggests that when parents kind of arbitrarily, not to their own mind, but when they make an assumption about which kid is smarter, first of all, we know they're not always right. That's one thing that research holds. And yet at the same time, that sort of typecasting can translate into big differences over time. They see that the other child has fewer academic kind of extracurriculars, and the discrepancy between their grades just grows and grows. So these small, intuitions that parents have that might be right or wrong can in fact influence things.
I have to ask you about, I'm assuming you probably grew up with sibling or siblings, given your interest and passion in this subject. How did the sibling dynamic play out in your own family? Because I'm listening to you and I'm immediately thinking about my older brother and thinking, were we differentiation? Were we spillover? And I'm sure everyone listening to this is trying to figure it out as well. How did it play out for you?
I think that there was a little bit of both. One of the things that I make the case in the book, I think that parent effects are um, people overestimate how much parenting matters in their kids' lives and outcomes. And I think that they underestimate how much siblings matter, because that's what I saw in the families that I really got to know, was that the parents kind of set this expectation, this like arrow of ambition in the air. But when it came time to landing that arrow, the siblings were the ones who really gave the advice or helped them figure out where to go. And my own brother encouraged me when I was 14 years old to start a school newspaper, which wasn't something that was really on my mind. But I think if my parents had suggested it, I would have rolled my eyes. But because it was my older brother, and he really understood like how is school supposed to work, and he really knew me, I was a little bit more open to the idea. But sometimes I laugh and I think, well, maybe it was differentiation, because my brother went on to become a lawyer. And if I hadn't been a journalist, I think I would have been a lawyer too. So maybe he was suddenly encouraging me to go in a different space.
So it could have been spillover, wound up maybe being differentiation. You've given us all something to think about. This is really fascinating stuff. Susan Dominus, that is Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and author, Susan Dominus, and the book that is out is The Family Dynamic, A Journey into the Mystery of Sibling Success. Thanks so much for joining us.
It was truly my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And that was the big story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leaving us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app, that's SEEKR, or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia, and thanks for listening.